She begged for death, but death sent her something worse, someone who refused to let her die. The village square smelled of ash and accusation. Margaret's wrists bore the marks of rope, her throat raw from screaming confessions she never made. 73 days in the stone cellar had hollowed her into something barely human. A shell that bled when touched, that wept black tears the healers said proved witchcraft. The magistrate's voice still echoed in her ears, cursed blood. 3 children had fallen ill after she'd helped birth them. The fever came, the seizures came. And when they died, small, twisted things in their mother's arms, everyone remembered that Margaret had been there. Everyone remembered her hands on their foreheads, her whispered prayers that went unanswered. No one remembered the plague that swept through the eastern provinces. No one mentioned the contaminated well. They burned her sister instead. Now, as torchlight flickered across the stones of the execution square, Margaret knelt with her chin raised. The rope around her neck felt like mercy compared to the weight of their eyes. She could feel their hatred like a physical thing, sharp teeth, hungry mouths. They wanted to see her burn. They needed to see her burn, because her suffering would prove their righteousness. The executioner's hands were gentle. She almost wept at that small cruelty. Then the night fractured. A sound like thunder rolled across the cobblestones. Not weather, but something older. The torches wavered. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that became a prayer or a curse. And through the darkness came a figure on horseback, cloaked in velvet the color of old wine, face obscured beneath a hood that seemed to swallow light itself. The executioner stepped back. Even the magistrate retreated. "Step aside," the stranger commanded, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "This woman comes with me." "She is condemned," the magistrate stammered. "Witchcraft, cursed blood." "Yes," the stranger interrupted, dismounting with fluid grace. "I can smell it from here, which is precisely why she is mine." He approached Margaret without fear, and as his hood fell away, she saw him, impossibly beautiful and impossibly ancient. His eyes held the color of dried blood, and when he looked at her, she felt something shift in her chest, like a lock opening inside a door she'd forgotten existed. "What is your name?" he asked, kneeling before her as though she were royalty. "Margaret," she whispered. "Margaret Whitmore." "I am Nikolai Vorstheim," he said, and the name itself seemed to carry weight, power that made the air taste like copper. "And your blood is not cursed, Margaret. It is rare." He drew a blade from his belt, ancient silver, etched with symbols that hurt to look at directly. With one fluid motion, he cut the rope binding her wrists. Then he turned to face the crowd, and when they saw his full face in the torchlight, they screamed. Not human. Not anything that should exist. "This woman is under my protection," Nikolai said, his accent wrapping around English like a predator circling prey. "And if any of you ever touch her again, I will drink you until your veins run dry, and I will do it slowly enough that you remember every second of it." He turned back to Margaret, extended his hand, and something in his expression shifted, the monster receding, leaving only an exhausted man with the weight of eternity behind his eyes. "Come," he said softly. "Let me show you what your blood truly means." The castle existed between worlds. Margaret could not decide if it was built of stone or shadow. The corridors twisted into themselves, lit by candelabras that burned without flame, just soft golden light that seemed to emanate from the air itself. Tapestries depicting centuries of history lined the walls, emperors and plagues, lovers and wars, all reduced to fading thread and memory. Nikolai led her through these halls without speaking, his footsteps making no sound against the marble floors. She followed because resistance felt impossible, and because something in her blood sang when he was near, a frequency only her marrow understood. The library was her first true glimpse of who he was. Books stretched toward ceilings that disappeared into darkness. Some were bound in leather so old it crumbled at the touch. Others were written in languages extinct for millennia. There were handwritten journals stacked on reading tables beside first editions of texts that shouldn't exist outside of legend. And in the center of it all, an enormous mirror framed in black iron, its surface clouded as though it reflected something other than the world. "This mirror shows truth," Nikolai said, noticing her stare. "It stopped working centuries ago. I stopped being able to see myself around the year you were born, Margaret. Perhaps the mirror gave up on me." He moved deeper into the library, and she followed. His movements had a dancer's grace, economy of motion, every gesture precise. He wore black silk and velvet, and when candlelight touched his skin, she saw it was too pale, too perfect, like marble that had learned to breathe. "You're wondering if I'm going to kill you," he said, not looking at her. It was a statement, not a question. "Are you?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm wondering if you're going to let me." He stopped before an ornate desk and gestured to a leather chair. She sat, and he poured 2 glasses of wine from a crystal decanter. The liquid inside was dark as arterial blood. He handed her a glass, and their fingers brushed. She felt it like electricity, a shock that traveled up her arm and lodged in her heart. "Your blood is rare," he began, sitting across from her. "Not cursed, resistant. For 3 centuries, I have walked this earth unable to drink from humans without descending into madness. Their fear poisons them. Their hatred curdles their essence. Their despair becomes my despair, magnified infinitely until I am drowning in human suffering so acute I lose myself entirely." He sipped his wine. His lips stained the color of garnets. "But yours," he continued, "smells like defiance, like rage that refused to break even when your body was breaking. You knelt before them ready to die, and you did not curse them. You did not beg. You simply accepted. That kind of clarity, that kind of resignation that isn't defeat, it's rare, Margaret, rarer than diamonds, rarer than forgiveness." "What do you want from me?" she asked. "First, to know if you want to live." He leaned forward. "Because I can feel you, Margaret. I can feel how close you are to the edge, how much of you is already trying to fall. That desire for oblivion is the only thing louder than your blood." She didn't deny it. There was no point. "If you ask it," he said softly, "I can transform you. Immortality. Power. Never again will anyone call you cursed because you will be too terrible to name. Or—" He paused, and something like sorrow crossed his ancient face. "Or I can let you rest. I can open my veins and give you enough of my blood to end this, truly end it. Painlessly. Forever." Margaret looked at her hands. They were thin, scarred from the rope. The executioner's noose had left marks like a necklace of bruises. She thought of her sister burning. She thought of the children. She thought of endless days ahead, always running, always hunted, always knowing that humanity would never see her as anything but a curse. "How long?" she asked. "If I chose transformation, how long would I live?" "Forever," Nikolai said. "Or until you decide you don't want to anymore." "And what's the price?" He smiled then, and it was the saddest expression she'd ever seen on a human face, which meant he must not be human at all. "Everything," he whispered. "You pay with everything." The transformation happened in a chamber beneath the castle, in a room that seemed carved from a single piece of obsidian. The walls reflected candlelight in fractured, prismatic patterns, and the air was thick with incense, myrrh and ash and something older, something that smelled like the earth after rain and the inside of old tombs. Margaret stood naked before Nikolai, and she was not ashamed. Shame required the belief that she had something to hide, and she'd left that behind in the village square. "It will hurt," he warned, tracing a symbol on her sternum with his thumb. His touch was ice and fire simultaneously. "Not because I lack mercy, but because death always hurts. And this is death, Margaret. You are dying so that you can refuse to die. He drew a blade, the same silver one from the square, and made a cut across his wrist. The blood that spilled was not red but violet, luminous in the candlelight, and it smelled like rain and copper, and something floral that made her head swim. "Drink," he commanded, and she did. The first taste was agony. It burned down her throat like liquid fire, searing every nerve ending, igniting her blood until her veins felt like they were being rewritten from the inside. She fell to her knees, screaming, but the sound came out distorted, not quite human, carrying harmonics that echoed wrongly off the stone. Nikolai held her as she convulsed, one hand at the back of her head, the other across her heart. She could feel his heartbeat, slow, deliberate, eternal, beneath her palm. It felt like an anchor. "Stay with me," he whispered against her hair. "I know this is agony. I know you want to run back to death, but you're almost through. You're almost free." The pain reached a crescendo that shattered into something else entirely. Her vision shifted, colors becoming impossibly vivid. She could see the individual threads of the tapestry hanging on the wall, could count every grain of wax in the candles, could hear Nikolai's breathing, his heartbeat, the slow circulation of his ancient blood. Every sense exploded into hypersensitivity, and beneath it all, underneath everything, was hunger. Hunger like she'd never known. Hunger that made the deprivation of the cellar seem like abundance. It hollowed her, a void that demanded filling. "The hunger passes," Nikolai said, understanding without her speaking. "Or you learn to live with it. Some nights are harder than others." She looked at her hands and saw them transformed. The skin held a faint luminescence, and when she flexed her fingers, she felt strength coiled in muscles that hadn't existed moments before. Her reflection caught in the obsidian wall, and she barely recognized herself. She was still Margaret, but refined somehow, clarified. Like the real her had been hidden beneath the human version all along. "What am I?" she whispered. "Mine," Nikolai said, and it sounded like a vow. "And more importantly, you are free." He stood, extending his hand to help her up. She took it, and the moment their skin touched, she felt it. A connection burning bright as a star between them. It was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with bodies. It was soul-deep, marrow-deep, written in the very code of her blood. He felt it too. She could see it in how his ancient eyes widened, how his breath caught. "This is not part of the ritual," he said quietly. "This should not be possible." "What is it?" she asked. "A bond," he said, his voice hollow with something like fear. "Blood recognition. My blood calls to you and yours calls back. It means—" He stopped, seeming unable to continue. "It means what?" "It means you were made for this, made for me." He pulled his hand away as though burned. "And that is the cruelest price of all, Margaret, because now I must decide if I can bear to love you, knowing everything I've seen, knowing everyone I've loved has turned to dust." She stepped closer, and he stepped back. For the first time since the village square, she saw him afraid. "Then perhaps," Margaret said softly, "we can be afraid together. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these immortal confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. 3 months passed in the castle, and they became years. Margaret learned that time moved differently when you were immortal. Days blurred into one another, months collapsed into moments of significance. Nights became her dominion. She discovered that her transformed body was a symphony of impossible abilities. She could move faster than thought, hear heartbeats from 100 yards away, see in absolute darkness. But more than that, she could feel things, the emotional resonance of spaces, the psychic echoes of old violence, the weight of history pressing down on ancient stone. Nikolai became her teacher and her jailer, though she couldn't decide which role suited him better. He showed her how to hunt without killing, how to take only what was needed, how to blur the memories of those she fed from so they woke unsure if it was dream or reality. He taught her the languages of his centuries, Latin, Old Church Slavonic, forgotten dialects of empires that crumbled into sand. He played her music on a piano in the tower, Chopin and Bach and compositions he'd written himself, pieces that sounded like ghosts learning to sing. But he would not touch her. After that first night in the obsidian chamber, a careful distance opened between them. He would turn away when she entered a room. He would excuse himself when their conversations grew too intimate. Once, when she'd brushed against him in the library, he'd left the castle entirely for 3 days, returning smelling of rain and wilderness. "Why?" she asked him one night as they sat before the enormous mirror that showed only darkness. "The bond. You said it meant something." "It means I'm a fool," Nikolai replied, his reflection absent from the glass. "It means my blood recognizes in you something it needs. But blood recognition is not love, Margaret. It's hunger dressed up in poetic language." "Then what is love?" she challenged. "Because I've read every book in your library, and I still don't understand the difference." He turned to face her, and his expression was haggard, the face of someone who had survived too much. "Love is choosing to let someone destroy you. Love is knowing all the ways they can hurt you and deciding it's worth the risk. I've loved before, Margaret, 3 times in 500 years. Once was a duchess in Vienna who aged and died while I remained unchanged. Once was a scholar in Alexandria who discovered what I was and spent her final years afraid of me. And once was a servant girl in Moscow who loved me genuinely, completely. And I had to watch her descend into madness as she realized she would never age, never change, never escape me or what I was." He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the eternal night that surrounded the castle. "The third one eventually asked me to end her. I did. And I have spent 400 years trying to convince myself it was mercy and not the cruelest murder imaginable." Margaret rose and moved beside him, careful not to touch. "So you won't love me because you're afraid." "I won't love you," he said, "because it's already too late. Because my blood chose you before my mind had a chance to protect itself. Because I can feel you in my marrow, Margaret, and that terrifies me more than anything has in centuries." She wanted to reach for him. She wanted to close the distance. But she understood in that moment the true horror of immortality. It wasn't the endless nights or the hunger or the watching everyone you knew turn to dust. It was the weight of all those years of hurt piled up like stones, until even love became too dangerous to touch. "Then we wait," she said softly. "If we have forever, we can afford to wait until you're ready." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Forever is not as long as you think, Margaret. Forever is just another way of saying goodbye in slow motion." But that night, for the first time, he didn't leave when she was near. And that, perhaps, was its own kind of beginning. Word of their existence spread like plague through the supernatural underworld. Whispers reached the vampire courts of Vienna and Istanbul. Rumors traveled among the old families of Eastern Europe. They spoke of the vampire king, Nikolai, who had not been seen in 100 years, and of the woman whose blood he'd chosen. Some said she was a saint reborn. Others claimed she was a succubus, a creature designed to seduce the immortal into destruction. The first hunters came on a winter night when snow fell like ash from the sky. They were vampire slayers, professionals hired by the church or perhaps by rival courts. Margaret never discovered who sent them. There were 7 of them, armed with crosses and consecrated silver, moving through the castle corridors with military precision. They killed 2 of Nikolai's servants before Margaret found them in the East Wing. The transformation happened without thought. One moment she was human-shaped, the next she was something else entirely. Fangs extended, eyes burning with crimson fire, strength amplified beyond measure. She moved through them like a storm, and they fell like wheat before a scythe. One managed to drive a silver stake through her shoulder before she tore his arm from his socket. The pain was exquisite, clarifying. She was not the hunted, she was the hunter. Nikolai found her standing over the bodies, covered in their blood, her clothes torn and her eyes still burning with rage. For a moment, he simply stared at her. Then, slowly, he knelt. "You're bleeding," he said, reaching for her shoulder. She let him remove the silver stake, let him tend the wound with his own blood, which sealed it in seconds. "Does it hurt?" "Yes," she said, "and I liked it." "That's the curse," Nikolai whispered. "The real one. Not the blood, not the hunger. It's discovering that you're capable of things you never imagined, and that a part of you enjoys it. That part of you has always been there, Margaret. The transformation just amplified it." "Are you afraid of me now?" she asked. He stood and looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since her transformation. And she saw something crack behind his ancient eyes. "No," he said hoarsely. "I'm afraid for you. Because now you know what you are, and you'll have to decide if you can live with it." The servants they'd lost were mourned that night in a ceremony that predated Christian tradition. Nikolai spoke words in languages that hadn't been spoken in centuries, and the bodies were prepared according to rites that honored their service. Margaret watched him move through the ritual with a grace born of terrible practice, and she understood. This was his penance. Every servant who died in the castle was another weight added to the burden he carried. "How many?" she asked when it was finished. "How many people have died serving you?" 73, he said immediately, as if he'd counted 1,000 times. "All by violence, all under my protection, all failures on my part." "That's not your fault." "It's always my fault," he interrupted, and his voice held the finality of judgment. "I am ancient, Margaret. I am powerful. I should be able to protect them. That I cannot is evidence of my fundamental inadequacy." She wanted to argue, but she understood the futility. This guilt was woven into his very being, as essential to him as blood and bone. It was not something that could be argued away. It could only be survived. Later, alone in her chambers, Margaret stood before her own reflection in the silver mirror. She barely recognized the creature staring back. Beautiful and terrible, marked by violence, capable of speeds and strengths that defied understanding. She thought about the 7 men who'd come to kill Nikolai, and she thought about how easily she'd killed them. There had been no hesitation, no mercy. There had only been clarity and hunger, and the understanding that she was better at this than she'd ever been at anything else. The question Nikolai had posed echoed in her mind. Could she live with what she was? And the answer, terrifying in its certainty, was yes. The ball happened on the anniversary of her transformation. Nikolai announced it as though it were a mercy, a gift, one night of celebration before they returned to the quiet isolation of the castle. He filled the grand hall with musicians from across Europe, and he had servants deck the space in silks and candles until it looked like the inside of a jeweled box. The guest list included creatures Margaret had only read about in Nikolai's oldest texts, vampires who'd survived centuries, witches with power written in scars across their skin, werewolves who moved with animal grace, even a fallen angel who wore beauty like a weapon. And he asked Margaret to dance. She wore a gown the color of arterial blood, and when he took her hand, she felt that same shattering connection, the bond between their blood recognizing itself, harmonizing. They moved through the waltz like 2 parts of a single organism, and everyone in the hall fell silent watching them. "I cannot give you what you deserve," Nikolai whispered as they turned through the music. "I cannot give you a future where you age and change and become something other than this. I cannot give you mortality. I cannot give you escape." "I don't want those things," Margaret said, "but you should want them. You should want to be free of me." He pulled her closer, and she could feel the tremor in his ancient hands. "I should love you enough to let you go." "Then it's good," she said softly, "that you love me at all." He stopped dancing. The musicians played on, but he simply held her, and she felt something shift in his chest, a lock opening. A door that had been sealed for centuries finally turning on its hinges. "I'm terrified," he confessed. "I'm terrified because my blood recognizes you as destiny, and I know what destiny costs. I'm terrified because I love you, and every love I've had has ended in devastation. I'm terrified because for the first time in 500 years, I have something to lose." Margaret reached up and touched his face. His skin was cold, eternal, unchanging. But his eyes held warmth, the warmth of something that had been frozen and was finally learning to thaw. "Then be terrified with me," she said, "because I'm terrified too. I'm terrified that this will destroy me. I'm terrified that it won't. I'm terrified that I'll want to live forever and that it will be unbearable. But I'm more terrified of being without you." He kissed her then, and it was not tender. It was raw and desperate and absolute, a claiming that tasted like blood and redemption and the breaking of every wall he'd ever built. And Margaret understood, in that moment, what it meant to be loved by something ancient and powerful. It meant being consumed entirely. It meant allowing yourself to be transformed at a molecular level. It meant choosing, every single night, to surrender to something that could destroy you. She chose it anyway. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts. The hunters came again, but this time they came in daylight. They understood now that Nikolai was vulnerable at dawn. All vampires were. And they'd coordinated their assault for the moment when his power was at its weakest. There were 20 of them this time, armed with weapons blessed by priests from a dozen different faiths. They came from Vatican connections and ancient hunter dynasties, united by the conviction that Nikolai Vorstheim was an abomination that needed to be erased. Margaret was sleeping when they breached the castle. A human sleep, deep and dreamless, the kind she sometimes required now that she existed between two states of being. She woke to the smell of holy water and burning flesh, to the sound of Nikolai's voice crying out in agony as sunlight flooded into his chamber. She moved without thinking. The castle became a maze of violence. Margaret was faster than them, stronger than them, but they had numbers, and they had the terrible advantage of tools designed specifically to kill things like her. A priest with a cross drove her back into a corridor. A hunter with a silver blade opened a wound on her arm that burned with consecrated fire. But for every one of them who hurt her, 3 fell to her retribution. She reached Nikolai's chambers to find him cornered against the far wall, his skin beginning to blister and char from the sunlight pouring through the broken windows. The hunters had him surrounded, holy weapons raised, chanting prayers that hurt to hear. "No," Margaret growled, and every hunter in the room felt it, the wave of primal fury that announced her arrival. She moved like vengeance itself, like a creature that had been forged in fire and violence, and the absolute certainty that these people would die for what they were trying to do. The priest with the cross died first, his neck broken before he even registered her presence. The hunter with the silver blade screamed when she tore the weapon from his hand and drove it through his eye socket. The others fell back, and for a moment there was a terrible clarity. They understood, looking at her, what they had always been dealing with. They understood that they had awakened something far more dangerous than a vampire. They had awakened a predator that loved. Margaret moved to Nikolai and pulled him into the shadows of the interior chamber, away from the sunlight. She could see the damage. His skin charred and blistered, his hair singed, agony written across his ancient face. But he was alive. And as long as he was alive, nothing else mattered. "Go," he rasped. "Save yourself. There are too many—" "No," she said, and she meant it with every cell in her body. She went back into the corridor and finished the hunters methodically, without mercy, without hesitation. She was not a savior. She was not a hero. She was a predator defending her pack, and she was efficient about it. When the last one fell, she stood in the center of the castle covered in blood, theirs and hers mixed together, and she felt something break inside her, not from horror or regret, but from the clarity of understanding. She had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. She was no longer someone seeking redemption. She was something that had already chosen damnation. She returned to Nikolai, and she offered him her wrist. "Drink," she commanded. "Heal. Use my blood, which is rare and resistant and carries within it the same fire that just tore through those hunters. I am offering you everything, Nikolai. Not just my love, my power, my fury, my will, all of it." He drank, and as her blood filled him, she felt the bond between them amplify into something enormous. This was not love in any conventional sense. This was recognition at a fundamental level. Two creatures of darkness choosing one another, choosing the night, choosing to build an empire of shadow and mercy in a world that would hunt them until the end of time. 5 years later, the castle had become a sanctuary. The hunters still came sometimes, but they came less frequently now. Word had spread through the underground networks that the Vampire King had a queen, and that together they were something unprecedented, neither purely evil nor entirely merciful, but something more complex and more terrible than either alone. Margaret stood in the library reading by candlelight when Nikolai entered. He moved with a grace that had only deepened in the years since their bond had solidified. The charred skin had healed completely, and he wore his immortality now with less burden, as though her love had absolved some of the ancient guilt he carried. "I was thinking," he said, "about the mirror." "The one that stopped reflecting?" Margaret asked. "Yes. I was wondering if perhaps we should try again." He moved beside her, close enough that she could feel the faint warmth radiating from his body, not body temperature, but something else, something that her transformed blood could interpret as comfort. "I was wondering what it might show now if both of us stood before it." They moved together through the castle's winding passages, past chambers and corridors that had absorbed centuries of history. The mirror stood as it always had, dark and impenetrable, its surface like looking into the void. Nikolai took her hand, and together they stepped before it. For a long moment, nothing. Then the surface began to shift, and an image formed, not their reflections, but something more profound. They saw themselves as the world now saw them. Not monsters, but survivors, not abominations, but architects of their own destiny. They saw the castle as it truly was, not a place of exile, but a sanctuary built brick by brick from their refusal to be destroyed. And in the mirror, they were beautiful. "I spent 500 years believing I was a curse to everything I touched," Nikolai said softly. "I spent centuries believing that love was the cruelest punishment of all. I was wrong." "What changed?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "You did," he said. "Or perhaps I did. Perhaps we changed each other." He turned to face her, and his eyes held the depth of 1,000 nights. "Margaret, in all my centuries of existence, I have never known anything except loss and guilt and the slow accumulation of sorrow. But with you, I understand something new. I understand that redemption is not about being forgiven for what you are. It's about choosing who you want to become." She kissed him then, and it tasted like blood and eternity and the strange, impossible grace of two broken creatures finding wholeness in one another. And as she kissed him, she thought about the village square where she'd knelt, waiting for death. She thought about the noose, the screaming crowd, the magistrate declaring her cursed. She had been cursed. But the curse had transformed into something else, into power, into clarity, into a love that transcended mortality and reason and every rational argument against forever. The castle around them seemed to hum with approval, its stones singing in a frequency only the eternal could hear. Outside, the night stretched on endlessly, and within it, they would build an empire of darkness and mercy for all the creatures the world had deemed cursed, for all the people society had abandoned, for all those brave or broken enough to choose damnation over despair. As dawn approached, that terrible hour when Nikolai had to retreat to shadow, Margaret moved with him into the depths of the castle, into chambers carved from the earth itself. And there, wrapped in darkness and the certainty of one another, they waited for the next night to arrive. Because forever, Margaret had learned, was not an ending. It was simply another kind of beginning, one measured not in years or decades, but in the infinite accumulation of moments chosen with a free heart. In the mirror in the library, their reflection remained visible, burning like a constellation against the eternal dark, and anyone who found themselves in that castle, fleeing from a world that had declared them cursed, would know that mercy existed, that redemption existed, that even the darkest love could resurrect what the world believed was dead. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned. 20 years had passed since the night Nikolai and Margaret stood before the mirror and saw themselves reflected as something other than monsters. The castle had grown in ways that defied architectural logic. New wings spiraled upward into darkness, carved from stone that seemed to absorb candlelight rather than reflect it. The library had expanded to encompass entire floors, its shelves now holding not just books, but the collected wisdom of creatures who'd chosen to seek sanctuary within these walls. Witches with centuries of knowledge, werewolves who'd learned to reconcile their dual natures, fallen angels who'd abandoned their celestial wars to find peace in shadow. And humans, always humans, people fleeing persecution, bearing scars the world had inflicted, seeking refuge in a place where being cursed was not a death sentence. Margaret had become something beyond what either she or Nikolai had anticipated. She was not merely queen to his king. She was the voice of mercy in a kingdom of predators, the heart that tempered Nikolai's ancient sorrow with something warmer, more hopeful. The servants adored her. The supernatural courts whispered her name with a mixture of fear and reverence. Some called her the Redeemed Witch. Others called her the Mercy Bringer. But Margaret called herself simply what she was. A woman who'd been given a second chance and had chosen to extend that mercy to others. It was on a night of impossible starlight, a phenomenon that occurred perhaps once a decade when the veil between worlds grew thin, that Nikolai led her to a chamber she'd never seen before. It was located in the castle's oldest section, carved from stone so ancient it predated human civilization. The walls were etched with symbols that hurt to look at directly, and the air inside carried the weight of ceremonial magic older than language. "What is this place?" Margaret asked. "The heart," Nikolai said quietly. "The original chamber where, 500 years ago, I made the choice that transformed me into what I am. I have never brought anyone here. I thought..." He paused, seeming to choose his words with care. "I thought perhaps it was time you understood the full weight of what you carry." He moved to the center of the chamber, where a stone altar carved in the shape of a heart rose from the floor. Upon it lay two objects, a vial filled with blood, the color of midnight, and a leather journal bound with silver cord. "The blood is mine," Nikolai explained. "Pure, undiluted, from the moment of my transformation, and the journal contains the names of every person I've loved across 5 centuries. Every name, every story, every ending." Margaret approached slowly, reverentially. She opened the journal, and her breath caught. There were hundreds of names, each followed by dates and brief descriptions. A duchess who loved music, a scholar who questioned everything, a servant girl with eyes like autumn. Some entries spanned multiple pages, others were just a single line, but each one was marked with a small symbol Nikolai had drawn in the margin, a heart pierced by a blade, I wanted you to understand, Nikolai said, that this love between us, it is not our first. It is not even our greatest. It is simply our most present. And I need you to know that I have watched love destroy beautiful things, and I have survived that destruction. I am telling you this not to frighten you, but to prepare you. For what? Margaret whispered. For forever, he said. For the nights when I will be consumed by grief for those I've lost. For the moments when the weight of all these centuries will threaten to pull me into madness. For the reality that even our love, no matter how true, cannot protect either of us from the fundamental horror of immortality, that we will watch everyone else we care for eventually crumble into dust. Margaret closed the journal and held it to her chest. She understood what he was offering. Not a fantasy of eternal happiness, but a contract with reality. A promise to see him and be seen in return, to carry together the terrible knowledge of what forever truly meant. Then we do it anyway, she said. We love knowing it will hurt. We build knowing it might collapse. We choose eternity knowing it might be unbearable, because the alternative is to surrender to despair, and I've already done that once. I knelt in a village square ready to die, Nikolai. You gave me a chance to live. I'm not going to waste it by being afraid of the cost. He took her hand, and she felt that familiar resonance, the blood bond singing between them. But it was different now, deeper somehow. 5 years of love had woven their essences together at a level beyond the physical. They were not two separate beings choosing one another. They were becoming increasingly a single entity, a shared consciousness wearing two different skins. I have something to show you, he said, leading her from the chamber. They ascended to the highest tower, to a room she'd walked past 100 times without entering. Inside, the walls were covered entirely in a mural, a painting so vast and intricate that it seemed to depict an entire history. It showed the castle through centuries, showed vampires and hunters, showed moments of mercy and moments of violence, showed the slow evolution of a sanctuary built from blood and choice. And in the center, occupying the place of greatest prominence, was Margaret. She was depicted in a dozen different poses, standing defiant in the village square, rising transformed from the obsidian chamber, dancing in Nikolai's arms, kneeling beside him as the mirror revealed their truth. The artist had captured not just her physical form, but something deeper, the journey from cursed to chosen, from hunted to protector, from desperate to resolute. Who did this? She breathed. I did, Nikolai said. Over the past 5 years, whenever you were sleeping, I came here and painted, because I needed to understand how to love you without destroying you. And I realized that the answer was not to protect you from the darkness, but to show you how to become the light within it. Margaret turned to him, and there were tears on her face, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition of being truly seen. All her life, she had been invisible or misunderstood or condemned. But here, in this castle of eternal night, she had found someone who saw her completely and loved her, not in spite of what she was, but because of it. I want to make a vow, she said, not the conventional kind, something deeper. Tell me, Nikolai commanded softly. I vow that I will love you for as long as eternity allows. I vow that I will carry the weight of your sorrow and help transform it into something that can be borne. I vow that I will build this sanctuary with you, that I will extend mercy to all those the world has cursed, and that I will ensure that when history is written, it will remember not the hunters or the fear, but the love that refused to be destroyed. Nikolai pulled her close, and for the first time, his ancient face held no trace of doubt or fear. There was only certainty, the absolute knowledge that he had found at last something worth all the centuries of suffering. Then let us begin, he said. Again, always, again and again, until the stars themselves grow cold. And in the tower of an impossible castle, suspended between darkness and dawn, two creatures who had been called cursed stood together and built a kingdom of mercy. The night stretched out before them, infinite and full of possibility, and they walked into it hand in hand, ready for whatever eternities awaited. The hunters would come again, the doubts would surface, the grief of centuries would sometimes threaten to drown them both. But they would endure, because they had learned the greatest secret of all, that redemption is not a destination. It is a choice made every single night to love despite the cost, to build despite the inevitable collapse, to believe in mercy even when the world demanded vengeance, and that, perhaps, was the only immortality that truly mattered. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned. Comment eternal if you'd trade your soul for love that heals. Like if you believe even monsters deserve a second chance.